Hello, Dylan Violette. Welcome to my
Hi, Dave.
channel. How's it going?
Not too bad. It's a little cold up here in northern Maine. We have a bunch of snow on the ground.
I saw that back east it's been pretty cold out here in Honolulu. We've been having 80-degree weather, sunny. So I don't miss the cold weather at all. I grew up back east, and people ask me, "Do you miss the seasons?" And I said, "Not yet."
Where did you grow up? Is it Lake Ontario or Lake Erie?
I grew up in Lake Erie, Pennsylvania, and that initially got me interested in the subject matter that we want to talk about today. I've been following your work. We've been emailing over the last, year and and you've been chatting with other people I know. And for those that aren't aware, Dylan here is a independent researcher, a phenom, a prodigy of old copper culture, archaic archaeological research, self-taught, right?
Yeah, pretty much. I got interested. It's a long story, but to sum it up, I got interested in the Hopewell earthworks. I started mapping those out in Google Earth. Google Earth Pro, it's different than the browser version. It has a lot more in-depth tools for measurements and mapping. And the Hopewell earthworks, those brought me down to South America, and I started mapping out those. And I always wondered what was going on around the Great Lakes because I had the old copper complex territory mapped out, but I hadn't done any in-depth work. I hadn't mapped out sites, mapped out artifacts, or anything like that.
Mm,
Eh,
cool. And that kind of brings me to what I want to talk about with you first is, you don't have any formal education. Do you have any college education?
I do. My education experience it's different. I'll put it that way. It's a blend of public schooling and homeschooling. I did go to college at University of Maine at Presque Isle. I was originally going to get a bachelor's in psychology, but there were certain classes that I needed for my degree that weren't being offered anymore. And so I switched my major to history and political science. And because of personal events, family events, I had to stop going to college. But I managed to get enough credits for a psychology minor.
Okay. So you have a psychology minor, you did a little bit of college. Makes your story so much more interesting because you don't have a PhD in archaeology, you don't even have a bachelor's degree in archaeology, yet you're a prolific researcher in the subject and you created these phenomenal maps of different things. And so I want to start off our discussion, specifically talking about how did you get interested in the old copper complex? It seems to be something that you're really maybe obsessed with. And, can you tell me what appealed to you about it? Try to think back when you first learned about the old copper complex and tell me what resonated with you and drew you into that research.
Well, like I had said, it got started with the Hopewell,
Hmm.
looking at their artifacts, and I could easily find maps of their earthworks and map those out in Google Earth Pro, but I had a really, really hard time tracking down the copper artifacts they were making. And I was really interested in their breastplates because a lot of them were painted and decorated with geometric designs. And throughout high school, I was really interested in mathematics and astronomy. And I had even gotten accepted at one point into the main school of science and mathematics. And so the geometry on those breastplates really interested me. And so I started looking around all over the place for any articles, museum databases, anything to find these Hopewell copper artifacts. And
Mm,
eventually that brought me up to the Great Lakes because not a lot, but at least a few copper breastplates have been found up there. And that brought me into the old copper complex. And a lot of the images floating around, it shows crude conical points and awls, different items like that. And when I first learned about the old copper complex, that's what I thought they were making. And when I looked at the timelines for that era, well, it fit in. You go from your simple, crude tools into your proto chiefdoms and later on chiefdoms of the Mississippians. That changed when I saw my first IA triangulate. For those who don't know what IA triangulates are, they're
Mm.
these really well made spearheads with rolled sockets and angular sockets, triangular blades, median ridges along the back. And I was amazed when I saw my first collection of these because they look like something you'd find in Copper Age or Bronze Age Eurasia.
Hmm.
And so
Yeah.
that really got me thinking, well, hold on. If people are finding these items, and not just these, that they were making a bunch of different items, everything from those spearheads to adzes like these. So it really got me asking myself, why aren't more people talking about this? For me at the time, it really stuck out. It stuck out like a sore thumb.
Hmm. That's interesting. That kind of parallels my journey into the old copper complex as well, where I think I was in a college class, or I was in a college class, and they brought up the copper cultures of the Great Lakes, and I'm from the Great Lakes, as we mentioned, and it was like they used metal, and it could be some of the oldest metalworking in the world, and no one, again, is talking about this, or no one is aware. I don't even think at that time I was aware that indigenous people of the Americas, or at least in North America around the Great Lakes, especially, use copper or any metals at all. I thought it was a completely Stone Age culture, let's say.
That's what I was thinking back in high school, too.
And then you see these artifacts like you just showed, and you're like, that must have taken some skill. And this doesn't seem like it was a one-off find, because there's, or one-off, artifact. They're not that, they're actually fairly common. And so they must have been pretty good at doing it, and must have had a regular supply of copper at some point to keep getting better and making these amazing artifacts.
Definitely, because I have a GIS database in a program called QGIS, and it's a lot more in depth than anything I could do with Google Earth Pro. And what's cool about QGIS, it's what a lot of professional archaeologists are using to map out sites and cultural territories. And when I was looking around for information on the old copper complex's item distributions, that way I could get a sense of, how extensive they were, what type of social structure they might have had. I came across a researcher named Monette Bebo Reinhardt. And in case you don't know Monette, she was the former curator for the Oconto Copper Burial Museum. She had started looking around Wisconsin and eventually across the country to track down copper artifacts from the archaic to the contact era. And I'm looking through her book for Wisconsin, and most of her copper artifacts are from the old copper era. And I started mapping those out, emailing her, asking when she planned on releasing her next books. And as those books were published, I purchased them, mapped out those artifacts, and I even managed to get some data sets from her that she hasn't published yet. And when you have all the known copper artifacts they produced mapped out, it really suggests to me that we're missing something with these copper workers,
Hmm.
because there are literally thousands, thousands upon thousands upon thousands of copper artifacts, everything from spearheads to knives to hulls, you name it, they made it.
Yeah, yeah, that is exactly right. And I think for those that may be tuning in and they have no familiarity with the old copper complex, how would you define the old copper complex, the time period, and just the cultures in general?
Okay, so as of today, our current understanding of the old copper complex views them as a like an interconnected network of different hunting and gathering communities with different subsistence styles that are sharing a mortuary tradition, and they are using a copper toolkit. Everything from, like I said, knives, axes, spearheads, fish hooks.
And these are mainly dated to the archaic period. So something, along the lines of 9,500 years ago to something like 5,000 to 3,000 years ago. So this is a time period in North America and the Great Lakes that precedes agriculture as well.
Yes, it precedes intensive agriculture. Mainly, it precedes maize agriculture.
And so that makes it so unique in world history because, as far as I'm aware, most metal using cultures are from, agricultural societies that are sedentary and they have specialists that can mine and develop, technologies made of metal. But in the case of the Great Lakes, especially early in the archaic, it doesn't follow that pattern at all. And it's so strange because in places like Bronze Age Europe, if you find like one artifact at a site, one or two, they're like, oh, this is a metal rich archaeological site in the Balkans, let's say. And then if you go up to Wisconsin or the Upper Peninsula, Michigan, we're talking lots of people, just homeowners, avocational archaeologists, professional archaeologists, find, like you said, thousands of these metal objects made by human hands in that area, suggesting the scale, like you're saying, we're missing the how intensive and widespread and huge this metal using society was that preceded agriculture during a hunter gatherer time.
Yeah, and that's that's right.
Mhm.
Because over in Europe, if somebody, let's say, a construction crew or somebody metal detecting in their backyard, or even somebody walking along a creek, if they find a cache of bronze items, whether it's in Germany, Denmark, France, it tends to make world news. But I've seen quite a few articles of people finding metal hoards. That's one of the names for them over there. They'll find metal hoards, bracelets, pal staves. For those who don't know, a pal stave, it's almost like this axe blade. Sometimes they're flared, and you have a socket for the handle. And those finds will make sometimes world news or even local news, international news. But that doesn't really happen that often over here, despite people tripping over this stuff in their backyards.
Yeah, I mean, metal detectorists seem to find these caches or hoards of copper items all the time here, and it hardly raises an eyebrow. It seems like with at least our major news. Yeah, it's that's so strange about the whole thing, and it's I've debated or talked about this with other colleagues. Even it seems like there aren't even many professional archaeologists interested in the old copper culture. There's a few out there, but overall, it's like even it's not even widely known among archaeologists in North America. They're out there chasing Egypt, ancient Egypt and Sumeria, Southeast Asia, and right sometimes in their backyard, there could be hundreds or thousands of copper artifacts that could be some of the oldest in the world. And it's just like, yawn. They're Native Americans, and they never made it to smelting. That's another one that you hear, but still what you're showing in the copper artifact suggests that even if there wasn't smelting, there certainly was a high degree of craftsmanship that went into these old copper complex items. And I mean, that's still pretty amazing.
Oh yeah, the high quality tool forms that these people were making, it's been noted since the 1800s when antiquarians were first really starting to research what Native Americans were up to. And unfortunately, back then there were a lot of flimsy ideas about who was here originally, whether it was the Native Americans or some European or Asian groups. There were even newspaper articles saying that these tools might have been made by Egyptian colonists. And I've seen some reports saying that there was a lost civilization of Phoenicians or even Vikings up here, but it's Native Americans,
Hmm.
and it's a long history of, well, I'll use this word, cultural erasure and genocide.
Hmm.
People were ripped from their lands and sent out west. A lot of history and oral traditions were lost,
Hmm.
unfortunately.
Hmm. And in addition to the copper items found along the Michigan copper districts, these antiquarians and the 19th century explorers, they found thousands of copper mines, or you could call them copper quarries, copper pits.
Hmm.
Some of them had adits. They went in horizontally, though. I've actually, seen some smaller versions, but there they were mining as well. They were mining across Isle Royal, Michipicoten, the Keweenaw Peninsula, North Shore near Duluth and Thunder Bay. And so this was an intensive, I like to call it an industry, a turning raw resources into items for use in trade. All evidence so far points towards even the mining preceding agriculture, preceding maize agriculture, let's say, in the area, which again is counterintuitive to everything we think in the old world. Mining, especially, happens in these complex, socially hierarchical societies with divisions of labor. And in this case, it may not fully fit the mold, the model that we have for the old world, making it so strange.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons why the old copper complex is still such a mystery, because it raises questions here. Why would people go to such lengths to mine copper? Why would you risk life and limb to travel out to Isle Royale when there's float copper literally all over central, eastern, and southern Wisconsin? But
That's
it,
a
it also raises the question, why did humanity start working with metals in the first place, especially copper, if it's not much better than stone?
that's a good point as well. We definitely need to get into that. Yeah, this functional efficiency idea that, a spearhead made of obsidian does pretty much the same thing or maybe even better than a spearhead made of copper. So why take all the effort to extract this metal from the bedrock and turn it into this if your stone items do pretty much the same thing? So I want to dig into that later with you and talk about some ideas of maybe why that would be. But when I was inspired to email you to invite you on, I had seen that you've been posting in the Facebook groups dedicated to people, interested in this subject. And I'd seen some maps you made. And something interesting you've kind of found is, you know, you argue that this old copper complex should not be, understood as a single uniform culture. And I think even in mainstream archaeology, that the people that are interested in this, they would agree with you because first of all, the old copper complex spans thousands of years. We're talking longer than the time period from the ancient Greek cultures to today. We're talking over maybe 5,000 years or even greater tradition of metalworking around the Great Lakes. So it certainly couldn't, 5,000 year long culture doesn't make any sense. But you're finding if you start to look using your maps and you pull together all the data, you're finding these, let's say, regional expressions of the old copper complex that I have never seen anybody put together before. And you've actually come up with different names for these, let's say, local expressions of the old copper complex. And like the Shield Archaic north of Lake Superior, the
Hmm.
Laurentian Copper Complex, and it's east of the Great Lakes along the river systems, the Riverine Copper Complex of, the Midwest, Ohio, Tennessee valleys. You have the Western or Oxbow Copper Complex centered on the plains and the regions adjacent. and west of the Great Lakes. And you have something you call the Northern Variant Interaction Zone, which is, up closer to the Canadian, or where do you put this in? Would this be near like Hudson Bay area?
The Northern Variant Interaction Zone, it's something I'm working on right now. Models inside that area, there are a bunch of well-made, exquisite tools that border on art pieces. Some are very large, and they're distinct from the tools that you'll find in central and southern Wisconsin. The majority of those cluster around Lake Superior, and as you move around out of that area, their numbers fall off drastically. And so I'm proposing that that whole area was an interaction zone of people moving from west to east or east to west, vice versa.
Okay. Now, what interests me about this is how did you go about defining each of these localities? I mean, obviously there's geography there, but it seems like you're finding both commonalities between them. One thing I noticed that you brought up is you often see red ochre in the burials. You often see dogs being
Mhm.
interred with these people, shell ornaments. But maybe you can get into the details of how you then, what were the differences that you used to define these regions?
Well, to define these regions, I'm relying on a model, a framework for another region that I've been studying. I've seen a I'm just going to go off track for a little bit.
It's okay.
Then I'll bring it back to these different regional variants of the old copper complex. I've seen a lot of researchers comparing the old copper complex to Roman technology, Greek technology, or as Larry Furrow's been doing for years, Bronze Age technology. Because we have a lot of Europe's copper mines mapped out, a lot of their tools are well known across the world, and they have chronologies, so you can track how their tools change over time. What I haven't seen a lot of researchers focusing on is the preceding Copper Age that Europe and the Middle East had, because it's around that time when we see the items reminiscent in some ways to the tools the old copper people were making. And there's a concept for Europe's Copper Age called the Carpathian Balkan Metallurgical Province. It's this distribution area, interaction network that stretches from the Carpathians and the Hungarian plain all the way out into the Russian grasslands. And so I've somewhat adapted that model and applied it to the OCC because it surprisingly fits. Because based on the data we have right now, over time, you can see the old copper complex start somewhere either in Michigan, upper Michigan, southern Michigan, or Wisconsin, and it fans out from there. It goes from the forested regions onto the grass. And so I started looking, okay, well, what are archaeologists saying about these regions? Which cultures were there? What were they using for food sources? What were they using for lithics? Things like that. Over in the northern Great Plains, some of the earliest copper that we've found so far gets out there by at least 4500 BCE, 6500 years ago. The same is true over when you head east into the eastern Great Lakes. There's a site over there called Alumet Island, and that site is associated with the Laurentian tradition, and copper artifacts are known to have been used by that tradition, and there are distinct phases for that tradition as you go forward in time. And from the literature I've read, when you have phases like that, multiple regional groups interacting in a limited area, uh, you would call it a complex. And so you can have the Laurentian copper complex, with each of its phases and each of its groups. You can go over to the northern Great Plains and you can have a similar thing there. The earliest copper we found up there, it's associated with a people called the Oxbow complex. When you head up to the Canadian Shield, again, it's a different environment. You have your taiga forest, your spruce forests, a lot of lakes and wetlands up there. You have moose, fish, all sorts of different game animals. And similar to the Oxbow and Laurentian, they're using their own distinctive arrow points. They have their own subsistence strategies, and they're also using a lot of copper. And it seems like the copper they're using, most of it's coming from Isle Royale. And so there's enough distinction there to give them their own copper variant.
Mm.
Going down south to the lower Midwest, there's another group there that's traditionally been called the Shell Mound Archaic. What these people are known for is importing shells from the Gulf Coast and using local mollusk shells in the different rivers in Kentucky, Tennessee, and northern Alabama. And these people are gathering either seasonally, maybe every so many years, and they're hosting these giant feasting events. And from the excavations that have been done there, copper has been noted. Northern game animals like martens, their bones have been recovered there. And at that time, during the Middle and Late Archaic, martens weren't in that region. You would have to get them from either the Northeast or way up north. And so what that suggests is these southern groups are also participating in this interaction network of copper and possibly, or even likely, based on later ethnography, uh, an organic artifact trade.
Organic. So how could you determine that martins weren't in that area?
The martens are a known northern animal. They're well known up here. Articles and maps showing their distribution, it has them limited to the northern part of North America. And yes, and the name isn't coming to mind right now, but there was an author focusing on the Shell Mound Archaic and looking at the different foodstuffs that had been found, the different bones, the game mammals, things like that. And he pointed out the marten bones. And based on data at the time, martens are nowhere in Tennessee or Kentucky. And so what he proposed is people from adjacent regions around the eastern Great Lakes or possibly in Wisconsin or farther north are getting northern furs and northern animals, and they're bringing them down to Kentucky and Tennessee as part of these feasting events.
So they may even be transporting live martins.
Possibly.
Possibly, because if the bones are there, you don't think they would take the fur and the bones, maybe unless the bones were like revered, but it seems like they would have taken, maybe if it was butchered and they took bits and pieces of a butchered marten, that's still very hard. I mean, it just doesn't seem to make sense unless, yeah, they're either bringing the meat or the actual live animals down that far south. So that's not, I've never heard that. That's fascinating that's even occurring. So you're saying, another term you just brought up, an organic trade network. So they're not only trading copper, which would be inorganic, and probably stone or other things like that, red ochre, but also martens, maybe their fur, their bones, their meat, even up to and including a living animal. And I know martens they're like ferrets, and they're kind of mean and vicious. I don't
Yeah.
know how you might have to keep it like in a leather sack or a wooden cage, something like that to get them
Yeah.
done.
If they're well, we know they're bringing dogs with them because in the south, in that riverine copper complex, that Shell Mound Archaic area, there have been a lot of dog burials uncovered. In fact, it's the most dog burials that are known in North America. they all cluster in that region. Literally hundreds of dogs are buried down there. And you can track, interestingly enough, where these dogs are heading through time. Once these shell mound people head up into the eastern Great Lakes, back in the 60s, 50s and 60s, an archaeologist named William Ritchie, he excavated sites around the Finger Lakes, and he uncovered marine shell. He uncovered conches from that lower Atlantic and Gulf Coast, and they found dog burials too. And as you go forward in time, from the middle to late Archaic, dog burials and shells, they start appearing further and further away from this shell mound area.
Whoa, whoa!
Yeah,
This is all news to me. So, but I can see how you would move a domesticated dog. It comes with you. But as you it makes me think. Then, is there a possibility these martens were pets of these people that they maybe train like ferrets we use as pets today? They're basically, I think, still pretty much wild. I mean, maybe martens were pets. Is there,
that it,
just a
it's an
speculation?
interesting. Yeah, I don't have any other data right now that would support that. But when you look around the Americas, especially South America with the llamas, it maybe there was like a failed domestication attempt, something like that. Maybe people started like adopting martens. And yeah, it's pure speculation. But maybe they adopted martens for a little while and tried like keeping them in little wooden cages or something as like a companion for dogs. Like one group's breeding dogs, another group is breeding martens, but they figured out that the dogs are easier to control and breed than the martens.
Yeah, and maybe more useful because I don't know what you besides just being a cute companion,
Yeah,
maybe I don't know what a marten would be useful. They don't bark, they don't they're so small, you really can't they're not like a good food source. A dog, you can many cultures eat dogs. So, is there evidence these martens and dogs, they're interred as burials, like, in a ritual, or do they show evidence of, like, cut marks on them as being eaten, or is there any indication either way?
for being eaten, I don't think I've seen any evidence that they're being ritually consumed. Though I will note that are you familiar with Cheryl Claston's work? Cheryl Claston, she is a researcher who's written a lot of articles and published some books on the shell mound archaic. She specializes in shells, and she got access through the Smithsonian a lot of the excavation data. How many artifacts were found, how many burials were documented at the time, and even maps showing the arrangement of human burials and dog burials. And it looks like people down there, they are giving dogs the same respect in burial that we'd give people. They've found dogs bordering cemeteries almost like they're defending them in the afterlife.
Wow.
And that actually has some ethnography to support it. Because one of the things Cheryl has done is she's compared the archaeological evidence from the Shell Mound Archaic territory and even a bit further north because other regions of the old copper complex were using this similar mortuary tradition with shell and red ochre and dog burials, sometimes with red ochre too. And she has several articles comparing those northern traditions with the beliefs of the Mexico's tribes, especially the Aztec and the Nahua communities. And they have a similar belief. One of their beliefs is of a region called Mictlan. It's in their cosmology, it's located north of Mexico, and it is associated with the underworld, with dogs as guardians, on your journey to the afterlife, one of the things that cultures down there, they believe that shells have to do with the afterlife and rebirth. And so she's seeing all these huge mortuary cemeteries in Kentucky, Tennessee, and northern Alabama. And she's proposed, well, maybe those two traditions are more related than we've previously thought.
Okay, that's interesting too. I mean, this is all so new to me. I'm trying to think you'd
That's one
absorb
of the
this.
Well, that's one of the issues I've had with finding people to talk to about all this research, because in the books and articles I've read, usually what happens is you'll get either one archaeologist or a small team focusing on a specific state or a region. What there aren't a lot of are something that Nathaniel Fawson has pointed out in some of his videos are regional syntheses. Multiple archaeologists with different specialties coming together to say, this is everything we know about the Eastern Woodlands or the Southeast or the Pacific Northwest.
And that's
And
what your
so
specialty is. You're the synthesis
that
guy.
that's what I'm trying to do.
That's awesome.
And some of the
Yeah.
people I've talked with about all this copper stuff, and even the Laurentians or the Shell Mound Archaic, they don't know anything about it. And so I can't really get any criticism for my ideas. They just say, hey, looks good to me.
Hmm.
But, in archaeology, if you're looking to publish professional papers, you need peer review. You have to find people who are at the same level or preferably, sometimes know more than you to
Hmm.
say, hey, you're on the right track here, but there are a couple areas here the dates don't line up, or, how are you supporting that? So that's what I'm looking for.
Okay, hopefully this video helps find a person that you can talk to about this because yeah, this is outside of my wheelhouse as well, but this is fantastic. The patterns you're noticing are very very interesting. And as we talk about archaic people or pre-agricultural, the dogs are buried ritualistically or they're showing the same sort of reverence for the dog burials. It just brings up the whole question of what did these people eat then around the Great Lakes? Because if you're mining or even seasonally, it's a pretty intensive activity. In the old world, we associate that with like lower class people, like laborers that are then fed with, oatmeal or bread or beer, like, and something
Hmm.
like this. And they're coordinated with some kind of central authority that's government, king, monarchy, etc. All this stuff doesn't seem to hold in the case of the old copper complex around the Great Lakes. So, but it's clearly was an industry. So there must have been some degree of labor specialization, let's say, at least maybe part of the year. Now, what would be your idea of how they would have supported themselves and fed themselves on, in the Keweenaw, Michipicoten, Isle Royal? How did they do that? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, that's been one of my questions for a long time, basically since I started seriously researching the old copper complex. I've read your book, I've read your papers, I've read Ryan Peterson's dissertation on their supply chain, how you can track from the extraction to the transport to Thunder Bay, up into Dog Lake and even beyond. And so I'm wondering, you know, you have the Great Lakes, the largest freshwater bodies on Earth. They're filled with several species of fish. You have sturgeon, a bunch of other smaller ones, and not only that, you have all the wetlands from the former glaciers. Those are filled with many bird species. You have beavers, martins, like I had mentioned, and all sorts of smaller game animals, from foxes to raccoons to the big ones like moose and bear. You have all those But the thing is, you have to take time out of your day. If you're in a small, mobile hunter gatherer group, you have to take time out of your day to track these animals down and kill them for food. And you have to bring that back to your campsite to cook and consume and, likely to process too for your hides, your bones, for your tools, maybe some smaller pieces if you're interested in burying the hunter later on in life with some of those items. But the question that kept coming back to me is the scale. The scale that your lead pollution data shows
Mhm.
for me and for other researchers I've talked with, it it suggests that they have a more reliable food source that allows them all this free time to mine, transport, and produce all these hundreds of copper artifacts. And one researcher that comes to mind is Damien Murray at Hope. He's been researching prehistory across the world for years. He's looked at everything from what the Northeast Africans were doing 30,000 years ago to the earliest complex hunter-gatherer societies in the Pacific Northwest and in Anatolia with Gobekli Tepe. He's even mapped out indigenous belief systems and how they relate across Asia, North America, and South America. He's a very well-read guy. And so I asked him, hey, Damien, with all this copper mining and all these well-made tools, from your experience looking at everything from hunter-gatherers to state-level societies, what do you think was going on here? And his answer shocked me because it's different from everything I had read so far. It's one of the most unique ideas I've seen for the old copper complex. He suggested that initially they were small egalitarian groups relying on flow copper, pounding out the small items as they needed, but still relying mostly on wood, and wood, bone, and stone
Mhm.
tools.
Mhm.
He theorized that between 8,000 and 6,000 years ago, when we think the Algonquins started coming in from the Pacific Northwest, is when the Copper People's Society changed. For him, the evidence strongly suggests that they weren't small hunter-gatherer groups, not entirely, but complex hunter-gatherers, more similar to the Pacific Northwest or the Chumash of Southern California or even the Calusa of contact era Florida. And for a social structure, he proposed matrilineal or patrilineal lineages controlling the access to copper, and eventually the surplus generated through trade, you know, from west to east, north and south. It allowed these groups who were mining to become stabilized enough to produce what are known as big men. These ritual specialists, some might call them shamans, who understand how to work the metal, what metal is good for making small and large tools, and what copper isn't. And so Damien proposed something maybe like a chiefdom or proto chiefdom. And with my maps, I had to hesitate on that because what we're lacking that would really help us push that ball forward are settlements.
Mm.
With chiefdoms, you tend to find year-round settlements at
Mhm.
specific regions, river confluences, river mouths, around lakes.
Mhm.
We don't have any of that. All we have right now are a few campsites and some workshops.
That's another big mystery of this old copper complex, the lack of settlements. I think there's some evidence for cave use
Hmm.
in Wisconsin, but if I remember correctly, they have never found copper items in the caves of these archaic people in like
No,
Wisconsin.
I think one of those is the Rat rock shelter. I think that's in southern Wisconsin. They found that's one of the lithic points they use. It's called the Rat side notch, and they didn't find any copper there, just these side notch points.
So there's no settlements that we know about. Yeah, that is it's my feeling though with that is they were living in something like a teepee with the leather, essentially a tent that they probably
Mhm.
put on shorelines or along rivers, and were semi-mobile, might have stayed there seasonally and moved along and just put their tents up and moved, and then didn't necessarily need to make anything really substantial, but that's still so strange. The winters are pretty tough there. You would think, oh, they would migrate to caves in the winter. Maybe they made igloos in the winter, which again wouldn't leave any mark on the landscape necessarily, but still keep people warm. But yeah, this and there's like no barely any infrastructure, and also near the mining areas. As far as I'm aware, there are no burials. I think Mark Hill mentioned they might have found like a part of a human bone at one point at a site he was working on in south of Lake Superior. There's no burials either near the copper mining areas. So we have no settlements, no burials, yet the lead pollution in the lake suggests it grew intensive enough, at least at points, that it must have been a pretty full scale industry because we don't see that kind of lead signature until mining in the 19th century
Well,
with
yeah, that's one of the intriguing things. So it's like if they're living, at least seasonally, maybe semi-permanently at specific river mouths or river confluences with a lot of fish, a lot of returning game animals that are predictable, you would expect some type of habitation refuge, lithic scatters, tent rings, maybe even pit houses for the more northern cultures, which we actually have evidence for at this time. If you head over to Labrador and even further out west into the Pacific Northwest, we have structures like that. And as you move forward in time, they change. You get the pit house and longhouse communities. As you move further south into the tree line with all your grasses, your thick soils, the evidence becomes ephemeral. Can't really find it. So many regions are still heavily forested that it's challenging for surveys.
so thinking specifically for Isle Royal, it's an island in Lake Superior. It's very cold in the winter, and I would call it pretty close to being inhospitable in the winter. The island is small enough that I don't think it would have supported huge populations of large game animals. So if you're out there, let's say in the summertime or in the fall or spring or something, and you're mining, would they've been eating fish? We find hooks, but what do we find any evidence for, let's say, like large scale fishing and fishing activity that could have supported populations? Because as you mentioned, those West Coast groups, um, they existed during the periods when maize agriculture was intensive in the Southwest, but they never took up agriculture because the salmon runs were so regular and predictable and large scale that they could wait for those, harvest large amounts of very densely caloric, fatty fish, process them, preserve them, and essentially not have to work to feed themselves too hard for the rest of the year. Now on Isle Royal, we don't have big rivers either.
No.
So there isn't that possibility. And the water out there is very deep, deeper
Hmm.
than you could really, net, let's say, large scales amounts of fish, unless they come to the shallows. So what's your feeling on how they would have supported themselves on Isle Royal? I guess you also brought up this big men idea, or important person idea, and you're saying that if they controlled access to the copper, so if they had the copper, did they trade for their food from other people that then supported them with food on the island, and they gave copper, or did they just survive by fishing?
Well, that's it's a good question. because when we have evidence for a type of fishing structure in eastern North America that's called a fish weir. What fish weirs are is they are basically corrals for fish. Hunter-gatherer groups living in the same areas year after year, they start noticing, hey, the fish runs at this place are really intensive, and we have all these people we need to feed. And so what they do is they'll set up either rocks or wooden stakes at specific places along the river. And when the fish have their runs to the spawning grounds, a lot of them will end up corralled in this area. And you can walk up and, with a net, with a harpoon, you can gather up all those fish. Sometimes, hundreds at a time, with especially intensive fisheries. So far, right now, we have 3 of these documented. There is one southern Ontario, just north of Lake Erie. That one started up uh, around the middle to late Archaic transition, around 3000 to 2500 BC. And Laurentian groups using copper are still out there at that time. We have another one in Massachusetts. I think it's around Boston. And again, that one gets started around the same time. And there is another one in central Maine, the Sebastopol fish weir. That one got started pretty much as soon as these Laurentian groups enter Maine. And they're bringing with them at that time, around 3000 BCE, they're bringing copper and Western item forms like banner stones and gouges. Gouges like these are well known for the Eastern Great Lakes. They're considered a diagnostic artifact for Laurentians. This one, you can see the gouge bit for hollowing out wood, and some of them even have an adze or like an axe bit at the other end. So you have to like this. You can hollow out your items, or you can chop with this end. And what the tools suggest is these people are doing some serious woodworking. And when you look at the burial data, not just for Wisconsin, where we have some pretty large old copper cemeteries, some with an estimated 500 burials. When you go over to southern Maine, and copper's getting out there too, we find similar high density burials all clustered along the coast. These people are participating in the Great Lakes interaction networks. They're getting banded slate all the way from Ohio and Michigan and sending their stone tools back that way. And there's an archaeologist up here. His name is Bruce Baroque,
Mhm.
and he's studied the old copper culture. He's studied the cultures around here, which are called the maritime archaics, and he's proposed that by at least 3000 BC, communities up here are swordfish hunting, heading out into deep, deep water at 5 to 25 miles off the coast to get swordfish. They're bringing it back to these tight-knit communities living along the coastlines with cemeteries of comparable scale and even artifact arrangement for the burials, strikingly similar to what you find in the Great Lakes. Even crescent forms, well known for the northern Great Lakes and even all the way out into Oxbow complex territory. We find them over here, except they're made out of ground stone. Same forms, similar sizes, same perforation holes, and just like some of the burials over in Wisconsin, we're finding the crescents over here too in burials with red ochre. And so what it looks like to me is these are interacting complex hunter-gatherer groups with a mix of semi-sedentism at specific key locations with predictable food resources that can be intensively harvested. And I think the some of these tool forms, the spud. I have 302 of these in my database right now. They're complex hunter gatherers who are relying on intensive fisheries and predictable migrations, deer, moose, black bear, things like that. They're going after these resources and accumulating enough that gives them this free time to make these beautiful tool forms.
Mhm. I
And so
see.
what I'm proposing for Wisconsin is fish weirs
Mm.
at specific regions where a lot of these copper artifacts plus what that can do is it allows for food surplus. Like I said, gives you all this free time to make these items. It gives you time to explore, to look for float copper. It gives you the resources you would need to mine. And it's a testable hypothesis. What I'm proposing is there were fish weir communities in Thunder Bay and who were acquiring large amounts of fish and possibly sending that over to Isle Royale. Either raw, smoked, maybe baskets, containers full. And we know they were capable of working with wood because we have all these woodworking tools. And we have canoes from Wisconsin at Lake Mendota, a recent one found going back to like 3000 BCE. Just like
Yeah, yeah.
this is this freaking canoe parking lot.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
you're going to need canoes to get out to Isle Royale. You're going to need canoes all the way out in the east to hunt swordfish. So I think the fish weir idea is one that's worth pursuing, one that hasn't been mentioned enough for Wisconsin and Michigan.
And, two thoughts here. The copper tools you just showed too, good for woodworking, are also good for making boating technology, like you're mentioning. So
Exactly.
you're creating the copper tools to create the wood objects that then support the at least logistical transport side of the copper industry and the trade part. So that, you know, the food's critical, but creating the boats is critical, and having
Hmm.
those adzes and axes made of metal, I think those would be probably more functionally efficient, especially the ads made of copper
Yeah.
than stone or something. But that remains to be tested, and I think I'm actually working on those ideas with Northo too
Nice.
for some, actual tests on the functional efficiency. So, and then the second idea that historically there is evidence for intensive fishing in like Ontonagon River on the southern Lake Superior at Sault Ste. Marie. Historically, the Sioux were that channel would have fish runs through it, and people would park themselves there and get sturgeon like crazy out of those rapids before it was dammed up and locked up. So there are a few, let's call them semi-major rivers in Lake Superior that would have had decent sized fish runs. But overall, Lake Superior has a very small watershed compared to its overall surface area.
Hmm.
And so the rivers that actually feed into it are quite small compared to, these big things you'd see out in the Pacific Northwest or even like the St. Lawrence River. But still have evidence for at least seasonal fish runs where these weirs could have been set up and used to accumulate massive amounts of fish. I think even in Ontonagon, if I remember right, when I was writing the book, I was doing some research on what the French had encountered up there early on, and they made mention that at Ontonagon that they would capture thousands of sturgeon when at the peak of the run every single day, and then they would have these drying racks, smoking racks they would put up to immediately preserve these fish, and then you
And we
just make
have
sense
Yeah,
that it
and
would
we
work.
have similar ethnography from Maine. The communities here, the Micmac, the Maliseet, and the Passamaquoddy, they would make fish weirs, and they told those researchers, "We make these fish weirs. It gives us so much fish that we can smoke, and it provides us food for weeks and months at a time."
Mm. Because it's when you hear that, that makes sense. Because the otherwise, when I first got into this, you're thinking, how do you feed some people out there in Isle Royal, like snaring rabbits and maybe you know tracking a moose or a caribou, and you with a group of people, you finally get it. You gotta butcher it immediately. And if you're out there in the summer, as soon as you butcher that thing, flies are all over it. It's gonna immediately start to basically rot. So you'd have to
Hmm.
continually be harvesting caribou and moose to feed people or rabbits, let's say. Um, and that just doesn't make sense. And then also digging more historically into it, the Native Americans knew the best seasons to eat certain animals like deer and
Hmm.
moose because you didn't eat them after the winter ended because they're so scrawny and so lean that you can actually do this thing called rabbit starvation, where if you eat too much lean meat, like rabbit, that's why I call it rabbit starvation because rabbit is by definition low fat. You can still starve. You can
Yeah.
starve yourself on lean protein meat. You need specifically high fat meat. And so that's why they would harvest deer and bear and everything right in the fall before the winter, because that's when they were the maximally fat animal. And therefore you wouldn't have that starvation issue. So people aren't aware of that. Like rabbits are survival food, berries are survival food.
Hmm.
They will get you alive, but if you're stuck eating rabbit all year long, you will get a distended stomach. It'll stick out and you'll essentially starve to death. And actually, Lewis and Clark, they write about this, that their indigenous guides, like they would go out and just blast deer and bring it back, and their indigenous guides would say, if we eat this deer, we're going to still starve to death because looking at it, it's way too lean. We need we need fat in there. And we're today so afraid of fats, but I think fats are way more critical to human diets than we give credit to. We don't even need carbohydrates. Like we can literally not eat a carbohydrate and survive. We need essential amino acids for proteins to building blocks, but the key is proteins mixed with fats are the most important thing to keep people alive and satiated and happy and not surviving and being able to sit around and work on other projects like copper working, copper mining, and everything like that. So, yeah, I agree with you on that. The fishing technologies must have been key in this area for having a surplus food source in this pretty harsh environment. The winters up in Lake Superior are harsh, and it's like,
Yeah. They're some
even,
of the worst in the world. The
yeah.
freeze thaw cycle. That's really bad. I mean, even over here in northern Maine, the winters can get really harsh.
And then a second thought, there's the wild rice in the Lake Superior area.
Mm, yeah.
I am not aware, but maybe you are. Is there any evidence for wild rice being part of this equation?
Not that I've read, but I think that could be feasible because by the time these shell mound archaic communities get settled down in the river valleys of Kentucky, Tennessee, and northern Alabama, it's not long after that we start finding evidence of early horticulture or early agriculture. Growing squashes, they are growing sunflowers, they are also growing smaller plants, grasses that many would consider weeds nowadays. And as time goes forward and these shell mound archaic people spread into Wisconsin, into the eastern Great Lakes, into Laurentian territory, even all the way up into Manitoba, because marine shell and shell mound archaic style artifacts have been found all the way up there. Even over in Alberta, shell gorgets, almost identical to what you find in the Midwest, are noted for some of those burials. And so, with this tradition of likely, I think, semi-sedentism, I think that's what you would need if you're focusing on early agriculture at the Mississippi Ohio confluence area. When you're going up north into Wisconsin, bringing that knowledge with you, and you find all this wild rice and you start experimenting with that, I don't think it would take long for somebody to recognize that it's a reliable food source that you can return to either seasonally or maybe in a rare case, if this area was anything similar coastal Maine, like what Bruce Bork has suggested, maybe even small year-round communities at very limited places, very tiny year-round communities, with everyone else living a mobile or semi-sedentism life. Because if you, and these are testable theories, what we would need to do is head out into all these lakes in Wisconsin and Michigan, lakes connected to larger rivers, and look at those places, see if there's any stone arrangements, like shapes like this made of stone or wooden stakes. If you find that, it would suggest to me that these people are gathering at these places using the intensive fisheries and possibly harvesting wild rice. Because these tools, these spuds, they're not just good for woodwork. You can attach this thing to a handle and use it as a shovel to dig up dirt if you're looking to harvest plants like wild rice.
And that brings up a second issue with the wild rice that we haven't yet addressed. If we're in the archaic period, by definition, we have no ceramics. That's kind of the old school definition.
Yeah. It's outdated now. We have ceramics for the archaic.
In Wisconsin, well, I know in
Not
Georgia we do. I'm talking specifically, Upper Great Lakes.
not in Wisconsin. You're right about that. The the earliest pottery we have for North America, it dates to around 3000 BC in the southern Atlantic coast, around northern Florida, Georgia, and South Carolina.
Mhm.
That's the earliest evidence for it. There is a second early pottery group that I have read about. It's mentioned in Archaic Societies. Brad Lepper, I think, has written some papers about it. There's pottery in Ohio going back to at least 3000 to 2500 BCE.
Okay. So that's right
And
on that area time period.
that's right at the edge of the Wisconsin, Michigan Copper People's territory.
Mhm. Mhm. Okay, so then, but let's say we're way back like 8,000 years ago. We're in Lake Superior area. Let's say, well, just for the sake of argument here, we don't have ceramics, which are
Yeah,
pots.
no ceramics
Now,
at
a
this
lot
time.
of plant-based foods need to be cooked in pots, like wild rice, let's say. So wild rice, you have to boil it for a long time to make it edible. And, I can imagine digging a little, a puddle in a bedrock and putting hot rocks in there to get the water boiling, but that would quickly diminish. I mean, you have to boil wild rice for like an hour or two to get that edible. And so without ceramics, it seems like wild rice would not be the most ideal food to eat. Most plant-based foods that you hear about historically, like maize and beans, or maize, I guess you can make into a flour, and then you have to add the limestone. I can't remember the name of that lime to make it activated, but beans is another one. Beans need a pot to boil in. Like the Iroquois, they would have a pot of beans and a soup essentially always boiling at their settlement historically, and they would add bits of meat to it, corn, other things like that, whatever they have around. So it seems like ceramics would be critical for wild rice. Without ceramics, wild rice wouldn't have been ideal, let's say. So then we're stuck back to the same question of, I mean, it comes back again, pointing directly towards fish and freshwater resources. And yeah. So,
Yeah, the pottery in Wisconsin. There was a paper put out not too long ago, I think 2019, by Matthew Sanger. He investigated one of these pottery using communities at the the southeastern Atlantic coastline at a place called the McQueen Shell Ring site. He and his team had found evidence there of a connection linking those pottery using communities with Wisconsin. And because they found copper down there, and his team, they did isotope testing on it, and it sourced to the Great Lakes. And so he's proposing at that time that these two communities were interacting with each other and were exchanging goods back and forth. And
Hmm.
so it's possible, this isn't proven yet, but it's possible that you have these northern copper workers sending copper down south, and in exchange, they're getting shells, which are documented in multiple sites in the Midwest and around the Great Lakes. And alongside that, maybe some crude pottery forms. Not a lot, because again, we haven't found any.
Hmm.
But with
Okay.
that trade going on, it makes it possible for them to have acquired uh, pottery.
Hmm. Okay. Yeah. So it's a possibility. Okay.
It's a possibility that can get proven with future research and excavations up there.
So I want to take us in a little bit of a different direction now. When people learn about the old copper complex and they find out that it went away, it didn't develop into bronze, into iron, then into steel. It seemed to stayed at annealing, cold hammering, and then there was a lot of utilitarian, large, heavy copper tool artifacts early in the archaic, during the archaic, and then those large utilitarian artifacts kind of go away. Copper, its use itself never goes away. It's used up until contact, but clearly it becomes more of a symbolic, ritualistic item, like you said, the breastplates and the headdresses and other really finely detailed copper working. So the decline of the OCC is kind of a mystery that's interested people.
Mhm.
My lake sediment research shows that there were these distinct periods of higher mining activity that then diminished several times, went up and down. We don't have full spatial coverage around Lake Superior. As you correctly and amazingly noted in an email to me, we haven't studied every copper mining area, but the ones that we have studied, we have good coverage across the Keweenaw. Northern
Mhm.
Keweenaw is covered pretty solidly. Isle Royal's covered, uh, I would say decently. All the evidence we have so far points towards the intensive mining activity occurred between 9,500 years ago and about 6,000 to 5,000 years ago. And then there's this decline. Do you agree with that feeling? Why would this decline happen? Do you have any thoughts on that? Maybe you don't even think the decline is real. Maybe can you talk about that transitionary period 6,000, 5,000 years ago, when my opinion would say my evidence shows that there was a decline. Now, what do you think?
Well, I agree with your evidence from the tested mine pits and the lake sediments. There does look like a decline in the Keweenaw and on Isle Royale. What I would like to see more of are those western mining pits further in the western UP that Charles Whittlesey points out in his maps.
Yeah.
And not just that, some avocationals have noted pits along the eastern shoreline of Lake Superior around Michipicoten Island. And Michipicoten Island is strongly associated in northern Great Lakes oral traditions with a spirit, for lack of a better word, called Mishipeshi. It's this fiercely territorial lynx, cat,
Mhm.
lion thing with either antlers or bison horns, and it's known to protect copper. Some stories associate it with pits, others associate it with payments. Like you can give it offerings and it will either give you some copper or it will go into your territory and defend you from enemies. And so I'm thinking, well, that Mishipeshu spirit, it's associated with Michipicoten Island and Isle Royale. And we have the avocationals and some professionals noting pits along eastern and southeastern Lake Superior where there are copper veins. And so what I'm wondering is maybe there are copper pits out there that we haven't noticed yet because they're so overgrown and forested.
Hmm. Hmm.
And
Yeah.
so to me, at least with Isle Royale and the central and eastern Kimono mining, it declines after, 55 of 5400 years of BCE. Well, the 54,
BT.
55, yeah, BT. I juggle between those because some people aren't entirely familiar with each one, so I have
Yeah.
to juggle back and forth and explain. At least for those two regions, there is a decline. That's noted in your lake sediment records. I
Hmm.
agree there.
Hmm. And other lines of, oh, okay, go ahead. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, but it's possible that those regions where they were mining, the technology they had at the time, they didn't have iron tools, they didn't have bronze, they didn't have dynamite. So it's possible they extracted most or all of what they could using the tools they had at that time. And then from there,
Yes.
spread out looking
Okay.
for newer sources of copper. And this would somewhat line up with their expansion into the grasslands out west and into Maine and the Appalachians. Because we have copper over here. There's copper in Nova Scotia. There's copper, I think, up in Labrador. And
Oh, yeah.
there's copper all along the Appalachians. And
Yeah.
we can see that later in time at Poverty Point. Uh, Poverty Point, for those who don't know, it's this large gathering site, this huge earthwork complex in northeastern Louisiana. It dates to the late Archaic period, roughly between 1500 to 800 BCE, around 3500 to 2800 years ago. And copper has been found at that site. It's been isotope tested and its sources to all over the eastern North America. Some of their copper is coming from Minnesota, some of it's coming from the Great Lakes, some of it's coming from the Appalachians, and a little bit might be coming from the Canadian Maritimes, from the copper mines in the copper sources in Nova Scotia.
Mm, mm.
And so after that decline in the Keweenaw and Isle Royale, I think it's reasonable to suggest that they're they're sending people away from this territory where the vast majority of their copper artifacts have been found. They're sending groups away to, I think, make alliances and ask, hey, do you have anything around here that you know, looks like this? You know, do you have any copper, any veins or anything?
Hmm. Yeah, I think it's totally reasonable to suggest, and like, so in a nutshell, you're suggesting, the copper activity could have declined around Lake Superior, but essentially moved elsewhere in later periods and up and into including just like east of Lake Superior, or even Thunder Bay has some veins, and
Hmm.
those zones west of the Keweenaw near the Ontonagon region down there. And this remains to be tested. Again, it's a testable
Yeah.
hypothesis. We can use the same things there. I have a few control sites for the lake sediments now from other people analyzing lead and cores, um, from southern Wisconsin, and we don't see those lead spikes in the middle Holocene. That's one criticism I've received. And I think it's a perfectly valid criticism, is we have few control sites, but we tried every time we would. That was the reason why we went to Isle Royal
Hmm.
to test against the Keweenaw, and then it's still there. And then we went the other side of Isle Royal, it's still there. But each lake site, interestingly, is has a different fingerprint of the lead spikes. They're not exactly the same timing or magnitude. Some have three or four spikes. Other places only have one spike. The southern Keweenaw at Boston Lake only has one spike, and it's the early Archaic, whereas the northern Keweenaw there's like 3 or 4 spikes. And so it shows that it's not just one dust storm or one meteorite impact that laid down lead across, because the lake 10 kilometers to the south has a whole different fingerprint in it. And so that is consistent with a local expression of mining, and et cetera. But I do also want to note that there are other native copper deposits in North America, but they're much smaller than what was found around Lake Superior. I mean, the amount of native copper, which is nearly pure at the surface, sometimes they would
Hmm.
have been like essentially pillars of copper, which we still can find under the water.
Yeah, a huge multi-ton
I mean,
boulders.
we're talking the level
Just
of
the,
copper
yeah,
there is nearly unimaginable scale. And there is just no other place in North America with that amount of copper.
no,
And so
nowhere else comes close to that.
even if they did find some Appalachian sources or some in Vermont, I mean, it's so minuscule in comparison.
And
Um,
it was Larry Furrow who had suggested those Eastern copper sources to me. I had messaged him and asking, "Do you know of anyone who's found copper over here?" And he pointed to those Eastern sources, basically saying, "Well, just because these people in Wisconsin and Michigan are using copper, that doesn't mean the people over here are using the same copper. They could have been going after those smaller sources, but we can't find evidence of that now because of modern mining activity and urbanization."
okay. Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. And Larry Furrow is a good friend of mine. I was actually at his house last summer. Um,
Yeah,
yeah, I got to see his collection. He's got a lot of stuff there.
yeah. He has everything from spearheads to a bunch of float copper and
Hmm.
reproductions. Yeah.
Yeah, he's got a bunch of reproductions. Now, another line of evidence for this archaic copper mining that I've come across and written a little bit about, but it's held up so nicely because it's helped us find a new mining district on Isle Royal, a whole series of mine pits that were undocumented, and they just were found in the last 5 years. But is this idea of the lake levels in Lake Superior. In the archaic, lake levels in Lake Superior were
Yeah.
higher,
Yeah,
specifically Nipissing.
there's
Now,
different phases.
yeah, all of the mine pits are on Nipissing shorelines or higher, as far as I'm aware. And to me, that's strong evidence again that this is an archaic activity that's
Hmm.
an independent piece of evidence. And another piece of supporting evidence for this is that every beautiful vein of copper on the Nipissing, or previous vein of copper on the Nipissing has been exploited. Like you said, it's been essentially all the surface deposits have been extracted to the degree they could have done with their technology, without dynamite, without iron. But there is one vein of copper exposed on the shoreline of Isle Royal,
Hmm.
the southwest shore. You can boat your kayak right up to it and look at it right on the shoreline, and it's not touched at all by Native Americans.
Yeah, so what's going on with that? Why didn't they go after that one?
Why didn't they go after that one? And so, to me, again, because I know some people at the Park Service are, we debate this. That suggests that it wasn't the woodland people, it wasn't the historic people doing this, because they would have obviously done the one right on the shoreline that anyone could find today. That one was under the water during the Archaic. That's why it was not exploited. And that points towards the intensive mining activity was archaic, because
Hmm.
gathering float copper, gathering bits and pieces of this had to have happened. I would think up until recently. We know there is activity for indigenous people across the islands on the modern shoreline today, but there's one vein that's preserved, doesn't show any activity on the shoreline today.
See, and that's interesting because if that decline in mining activity reflected them, exhausting all their veins, I think it's reasonable to suggest that by this time they had searched around Isle Royale looking for the easiest veins to get. I think that's entirely reasonable to suggest at this time.
Hmm.
So, why didn't they get that vein if it's right there?
That's the $1 million question. So this then brings up the book a little bit, and
Hmm.
my hypothesis, which I don't think I is published anywhere except in my book, is I call it the diminishing returns hypothesis, where the decline of intensive mining around Lake Superior was due to the fact that they had exploited all the easy to access veins and deposits that they could get with their technology that were not buried under meters of soil and glacial till. They were somewhat exposed or under shallow, deposits. That the diminishing returns means that when you're when you go there, you put in 1 unit of work, you get out 3 units of copper. Then you put in more work, and the amount of units of copper that come out start to decrease. For all of a sudden, you're putting in 10 units of work, 1 unit of copper, and then all of a sudden, you're just working so hard, and there's barely anything coming out of the mines. That's a known
Hmm.
phenomenon across all finite resource extractions. Logging is a good example where you log the easiest to get stuff, then you have to go up in the valley on the slopes. And then eventually everyone just realized there's no reason to put any more effort in here because we
Hmm.
don't get the cost that goes into it does not justify the production that comes out. And then I think that's the best explanation that we have for the decline of the mining. I think because it it first of all explains a couple things that other hypotheses don't explain. So another one I put up is there's this drought that hits
Yeah.
Wisconsin and Elk Lake and even Lake Mendota now with this parking lot way out in the lake suggests that in the middle Holocene there was a pretty severe drought that hit the Midwest in a normally pretty wet environment. And it seems like Elk Lake, which is one I'm familiar with, pretty much dried out. And you could imagine um, that would have been a huge factor at play, especially for people dependent on fishing resources. But the thing is, that drought was temporary.
Hmm.
Came, over time, went away, and therefore you would think, okay, then mining would return. This diminishing returns hypothesis, I think, explains the decline of the old copper complex mining better than, let's say, a drought, because a drought would have went away because the permanence of the decline in mining as inferred through the lead activity. It's that background around 5,000 years ago at all of our sites, and it persists at background all the way up until the 19th century when mining is reactivated. So that needs to be explained because
Hmm.
prior to 5,000 years ago, there seems to have been multiple times where mining activity grows, declines, grows, so declines. And so it seems like groups find a new lode, exploit it. That load goes away. They go, oh, if we go south here, we find another one, goes up, goes down. And they kind of move around, shift around, find their best exploited one with the
Yeah.
technologies they might have brought in, better understanding the technologies they had, and techniques for finding loads might have improved and things like that. But this permanence after 5,000 years ago up until contact suggests that they just there was no way to reactivate the mining at that scale without iron technologies, without dynamite, without maybe even beasts of burden, which would be horses, or in our cases in the modern time, fossil fuel energy. And this is even supported, this diminishing returns idea is supported historically because first in the 1700s with Alexander Hamilton, a British explorer, he knew about copper in the area. He attempted to mine it, and they write back that there's just no way you can do it up here. There's no infrastructure. It's so hard to get this copper out of bedrock in any sort of economically profitable way.
Yeah. It's
Even
not profitable at that time.
yeah,
No.
and even the indigenous people relinquished the lands and they opened it up in the 1840s. They brought in mainly It was European people, American people that brought mining techniques. I think that they were mainly Cornish coal miners, and they even had trouble with iron and horses for like the first decade of just
Yeah.
up there. They couldn't make a buck. They were like, they would drill holes and stuff, and they would be so rich with copper that they would blow it up and the copper would just dent and not explode out like coal would have done. And so they had to then reinvent a new style of mining to extract this highly pure copper metal out of this extremely hard bedrock. I've personally smacked that bedrock with a steel hammer. It's a metamorphic basalt. It's 1.1 billion years old, crystalline rock. I mean, it's dense, heavy
Yeah.
rock that steel hammers full on smack, ding, barely even leaves dust on the rock.
Now imagine what copper would do if you
Yeah,
struck
then
that
you
with a copper
with a
hammer.
copper hammer. So they had to. So that shows that the copper that was able to be extracted, maybe the copper that was poking up out of the ground, the thin veins, because they really liked the thin veins of copper because you could just break the bedrock around it, probably bend it back and forth till it breaks off, build fires alongside the veins, which we have evidence for now with Ryan Peterson and other people's work on Isle Royal. And
Hmm.
so that the diminishing returns explains all that. It shows that that 5,000 years of old copper complex mining extracted all, we would call it the profitable copper, easy to obtain copper, leaving behind pits and stuff that for another 5,000 years people just could not, it was not worth it for them to go up there and try to get it out of the rock again anymore. And then even when the 19th century people come through, takes them 10 years with iron, with previous traditions they bring from Europe, right?
Yeah.
Knowledge.
And even then,
Even
you,
then it took hard. And in many of the copper mines, all of them on Isle Royal never were profitable. But the ones that were, like Quincy and things were all along the southern shore. But there were many failed ones. A handful of them made all the money for that area. So I think the diminishing returns hypothesis is what explains the mid Holocene, middle Archaic decline in mining. Do you have any thoughts you want to add on to that?
yeah, there's something else I could throw into that mix. Maybe it wasn't just the diminishing returns. Maybe that's just one piece of a larger puzzle. Because going back to the shell mound archaic, like I had said, you can track their spread across the Midwest, up into the Eastern Great Lakes, up into the Northern Plains. By the time a lot of Gulf Coast and shell mound archaic style mortuary patterns begin appearing in Wisconsin is around the same time and after this decline happens. And so I'm wondering, maybe it's a little bit of both. Maybe because in Wisconsin, from the end of the Ice Age up until 6,500 years ago, when they start really intensively mining on Isle Royale, a lot of their burials are either cremation or completely extended. And for those who don't know, extended burial, picture somebody lying perfectly straight on their back with hands to the side. That's what an extended burial is. And that's one of the main types that these old copper people started using up until we start seeing shell appear in Wisconsin's record associated with early OCC burial sites like at Oconto. They've documented lightning walk from that site. And lightning walk that can come from either the southeast Atlantic coast or the Gulf. As you go forward in time, you start seeing more red ochre usage and a lot more flexed burials. And flexed burials are significant because that's the primary burial style noted for the shell mound archaic. Also associated with those burials are a lot of marine shell, local snails, even some snail species like a Ankylusa, like a Leptoxtus. That's another name for it. Back then, the primary region you would find that is in the shell mound archaic area. And so around the time you start seeing more shell mound archaic influence and the spread of this different mortuary tradition into the northern Great Lakes, around the same time this decline happened. So it could be a bit of both. Maybe this different mortuary tradition, which Kenneth Sassaman, an archaeologist working in the southeast, he's written about these two different traditions in his book, The Eastern Archaic Historicized. And he's even proposed maybe these two groups were at conflict with one another, that you have these northern copper workers and these incoming shell mound groups, and they're both competing for resources, and eventually the shell mound group manages to come up into Wisconsin and almost end what they were doing with copper. Because like you had said, we have all these huge float copper boulders that people are still finding, like some
Yeah.
that are being found off in the water, and these other copper veins that are visible in the landscape but aren't being used. So I think diminishing returns, it's completely valid explanation. I agree with that because it's very telling that the lead pollution spikes don't really appear until modern mining. And so I think it could be that, but it could also be this different mortuary tradition spreading up into the Great Lakes.
Mhm. And maybe displacing those people, or they're coming at the end of the diminishing returns where that way of life is maybe ending or becoming harder and harder to maintain. And then you have the drought happening, you have people moving up.
Hmm.
Um, and yeah, I think that's very interesting. I did not know about the shell mound groups, the evidence that they might have kind of moved up that way.
One of the challenging parts about the figuring out which of these proposals, was it diminishing returns? That seems pretty likely.
Hmm.
But for these other theories, like the timing, we don't have a lot of good chronologies for the old copper complex because so many of their tools were just discovered in by farmers plowing fields, by kids playing in gravel quarries and along riverbanks. So they'd pull out these tools and they'd show them to their parents or their friends, and eventually the museums would get involved. Collectors would purchase them. The chronology issue, if we had more carbon dates for some of these tools, because copper preserves organics, especially if they're in close contact. We've been finding some samples, but we don't have nearly enough to say, well, these incoming shell mound groups, are they having a really big effect, or is it like you're saying, is it mostly diminishing returns?
Yeah, those are all very good questions. We definitely need more dates and to get these chronologies down, and that's something I've been
Yeah,
working on with people. The problem we have is a lot of these are avocational archaeologists that find these, and it's not very. Even though if you're on private land, it's completely legal to do this in places like Wisconsin. The context is removed when you take it out of the
yeah.
ground, and therefore you don't. That's very critical to have.
That's a big problem. If you get an avocational up there who doesn't know what they're doing and doesn't take pictures, doesn't measure how deep it is,
Yeah,
doesn't note the orientation or anything unique about that area, just brings their metal detector up there, finds a copper, and posts it to social media.
yeah,
I don't think that's the right way to do it at all.
yeah. Um, and so, but almost all the new items we have are from avocational archaeologists, and some of these do have wood shafts inside them,
Which
like
is interesting.
yeah, that we could date. And so, trying to walk a fine line here and work with people as long as they're legal but it remains to be seen what's going to happen there. But I agree, we just need more dates. We need more dates on these items to get this chronology down.
And not just more dates, we need more people, I would say, getting into GIS, combing through all these books and articles, even stuff sitting in libraries collecting dust. Go through these and pick out, what are they talking about? Are there any artifacts, percentages, distribution maps, anything? Get it into a database so you can compare and contrast different cultures, different interaction networks, things like that. Because the copper, it's one piece of the story. To figure out what was going on, you need so many different data sets working together. You need the lithics, the migrations, where the burials are. It's a lot of work.
Yeah.
A lot of work.
Earlier, we talked about the functional efficiency idea of copper. One problem we have is copper isn't much more functionally efficient than stone or antler, let's say for making projectile points or cutting tools like knives. And this is not my work. This is Michelle Beber's work, you're probably aware of. And, she shows that, copper is not that great of a material for projectile points or for cutting tools. But I think she is missing a critical factor, and it's actually very hard to test. But one advantage that copper brings to the table is that it's malleable. And
Yes.
and stone obviously is not malleable. It's very brittle, and
Hmm.
antler, and same with bone. This malleability then thus makes it unique in the archaic world. Now,
Hmm.
when you have a malleable thing or malleable material, you can make hooks
Yeah,
better than any other material because you can bend it into a shape.
exactly. Yes. It's not going to shatter if you pull up something too big. It's just gonna
Yeah,
work, and
right,
you
right.
can bend it back. You don't have to invest the time to make a brand new fish hook.
Yeah, and another thing is you can make very small hooks with copper for fish with small mouths, because we know in the
Hmm.
Pacific and in the Atlantic, you can make bone hooks. Well, they make them out of actually mussel shells, but these hooks are for fish with big mouths, and they don't hook in, they embed into the mouth, into the fish's body. And so being able to make a hook that is small would be very, very important in these fresh water environments, particularly in deep water through the
Yes.
ice where you can't net or spear as easily. I think this is the critical factor that's missing in understanding why copper was so in demand that it wasn't just float gathered. They had to find a regular source of copper that they could depend on, meaning mining, and get on a year, every year. The problem is this is all speculation.
Well,
We
that's
don't
the thing.
know. We
We can
don't know.
speculate all
Yeah,
day long, but until we actually get out there in the field and have people look around, see what evidence is there, it's just
yeah.
interesting speculation.
Well, we know there's lots of hooks. That's
Yeah,
certainly not
that's been
speculation.
documented.
And not only that, there's a spear, and the Leicester spear, which has hooks on the front of it with a pointy thing that they put, and it grabs the fish, and then the hooks like bend in and hook into the fish. So you have that, but there's clearly some that are hooks that were tied to a line because they'll have like a little hole at the top of it. Remains to be seen. Again, I'm working with North O2. We found a piece of float copper in the field when we were up on Lake Superior this past summer. Dane hammered it into a fish hook, but
Yeah, I had seen that.
the fish hook was
Yeah.
very small and not really useful. But our idea was to try and go out there with the hook to see if we could catch some stuff with a copper hook that was in the old copper culture style. Unfortunately, we didn't. Then our second thought when we were out there was maybe it's also the luster of the
Mm,
copper, like a fishing lure, because there's
yeah.
many fishing lures that are copper spinners, copper hooks, and maybe you don't even need bait because of the luster of the copper just in that water would have looked so cool that maybe they just would have bitten it anyway. So we brought some like copper rooster tails, which I actually caught fish on the copper rooster tails. We didn't catch enough fish using different technologies to be like, oh, there's a significantly better advantage of the copper over this. Um, and Dane also has tried to do a little bit of sturgeon fishing with it, but my gut feeling is though, and maybe someone watching this with these new fishing cameras underwater, maybe with an aquarium, because it's so hard to have a control to see. You'd have to have bone hooks, antler hooks, copper hooks, and see, is it better, and like why would it be better? you know One feeling, we had I think a commenter on one of the videos, I don't remember exactly, but Dane had somebody mention to him copper is way too soft. It would straighten out if you did pull in like a pike or a muskie. But if you actually look at the hooks and you look at the
Yes.
shafts, they're not round, they're
No.
squared or triangular. And so that
Yep.
gives it a rigidity that doesn't make it as easy to bend. Not only that, if you cold work it a little bit, the copper actually becomes a lot harder in that place. And so I think it would be fine to pull up, a 5 pound fish or less.
Yeah, because you have the cold worked fish hook, but you also have the angular design.
Yeah. You have that
So
angular design.
that gives it a lot of extra strength, what you'd need to pull up big fish in Lake Superior or any of the other Great Lakes.
And it also would be extremely important for ice fishing because
Yes.
up there, it's very cold, and most of the year you can't access these important resources. So if you might not have gathered enough food from your fishing weir, or you want to supplement your food, you'd have to go through a hole in the ice,
Hmm.
and having a copper hook again, or a leaster spear to pull jam in there, pull something out, would have been. Now that's what I think our functionally efficient hypothesis needs to go towards. And I think this will be why they needed that copper, and they needed it to such a degree that they mined it. And I think then the secondary thing would be that it made excellent woodworking tools, as you
Hmm.
brought up. But the problem with the woodworking tools, they're not building any houses, as we mentioned.
Yeah.
There's no houses, but
None have been none have
yeah,
been found.
none of them found. So then what would they be making out of wood that's so important? Boats.
Boats, tool handles, maybe like wooden storage boxes, things like that.
Yeah, I think the boats are the critical thing here because
Yes.
they both explain the transport, this large scale trade network, and the ability to get out to the mines and to fish. So you need the copper. It is more functionally efficient than stone and wood when it comes to being a fishing culture. It is
Yes.
not critical for projectile points. It's not critical for knives. Even it's not, it actually is a crappy knife, but it does work. And we did test that. We gutted a fish using a copper knife sharpened with a rock, and it works. But I'll tell you one thing, a stainless steel knife works way better. And we didn't have this, but I know an obsidian knife, which is sharper than stainless steel, would have been much better for butchering animals and fish. But the copper still does work there. But yeah, again, it's not more functionally efficient. Because and the reason, another reason we bring this up is because this is one potential explanation for the decline of the old copper culture. Was it's in, we call it a lithic poor region, so there aren't many exposures of rocks around Lake Superior that make good lithic technologies. There's some like rhyolites or something that they can use in a pinch, but all the good flints and cherts and obsidians are not found around there. So you're in a lithic poor area. The copper's kind of like, "Oh, it's the best thing we have here." But as soon as some tribulations come along, a drought, a new people move in, But they quickly be like, we don't even need this anymore. We're done with this. It's not worth the time to get because it's not much better. But I don't agree with that though, because of it was functionally efficient for something probably much more important to the archaic societies, the fishing and boating technology. Any thoughts on that? Because I want to then get into one last thing with you. Any final thoughts on that?
Well, with the functional efficiency, I agree with you there. It's very good for making fish hooks. And one, or maybe not one, maybe a series of studies that I would like to see, maybe from Michelle Beber or another one of her colleagues, is looking at the benefits of socketed tools. Yeah, I haven't. It gets brought up. It's the iconic feature of the IA triangulates. Yet, I haven't seen a single study that looks at the functional efficiency of a socketed copper projectile point versus an unsocketed one with simple hafting or cordage binding.
Which she
Because with the
used. Yeah.
with yeah,
Yeah.
and it's interesting because she posts images of these tools, yet the tool she used looks
Yeah.
nothing like these.
Yes.
So what I would like to see done is another functional efficiency test, preferably using the Joe Neubauer technique. As far as we can tell, for those who don't know, Joe Neubauer is an experienced copper copper he was he worked with copper for decades, and he worked alongside Larry Furrow. And as of right now, we're thinking this is what they use to make all their copper artifacts. It's a pounding and annealing cycle on a bed of wood embers. Joe used white oak, and he was able to get temperatures hot enough to melt out the silver for some of the artifacts, and used traditional methods, the methods that these copper workers would have had. And so I would like to see Michelle or one of her colleagues make some replicas using his techniques, traditional methods, and test the functional efficiency of sockets, because most of their tools that we've found so far are socketed, especially the well-known ones.
Yeah. And you need to be able to bend it around the shaft and instead of using.
Yeah, because it gives you advantages if you're doing a lot of digging, which you can do with the spuds. Uh, Don Spahn, a well-known copper researcher for the copper culture, he's published a bunch of journals. He has a volume dedicated to spuds, and in that section, he shows you just because most spuds have a curvature, it's actually a multi-tool. You can haft it perpendicular to your handle, and you can have an ice pick. You can haft it like this. You have a traditional adze, or you can haft it like this, gives you an axe. And this is just one. It's spuds. The blade for spuds, they come in many different shapes and sizes. Some are pointed, some are more curved like this, others are a lot shorter. And so what I would like to see done is functional efficiency tests for all of their socketed tools, because that adds another degree that we can test. You have the malleability, which you're proposing, which I
Mhm.
agree with,
Mhm.
but we have the socketed technology that's getting mentioned, but there isn't much testing being done on that.
Wow, that's a great idea. That's a phenomenally genius idea, and I have had people bring up, and I think I've seen comments, and Larry Furrow immediately messaged me, and we talked about the fact that Weber's work used projectile points made of copper that look nothing like the OCC points. And it's like,
And not
why?
just that,
Yeah,
not sorry, not to interrupt, but
that's good.
it's not only that, the images she shows, they're nowhere near as polished or refined as the tools they were making. Her arrow points look like something an apprentice or a beginner would make. And that
Hmm.
actually does matter,
Yeah,
because float copper can have flaws, and there are slight differences in the copper vein up in the Keweenaw. I think Larry's talked about this. He's posted a bunch of images showing the different types of copper and the benefits for each one, the different colors. And there are some articles published in the Central States Archaeological Society journal that talk about Joe Neubauer's work. I think the articles were written by David Peterson, and he really gets into that. It takes years and years of experience to find which copper nuggets, if you're going after float copper, which of those are going to make, a triangle like this. Because even with finding an ideal piece, you can get into the final stages of production and the tool will snap.
Yeah,
You'll hit a flaw and it'll break.
it'll break. Yep. Yeah, finding out that would have been such a that would have sucked so bad because
But
I
yeah,
I I pounded a little bit of copper, and unless you have a really high quality pure piece, you'll soon find out when you hit it, it starts, the minerals, crystal minerals, powder, they fall off. And then it's a very powder rich process and gets in your
yeah,
nose and your nose hairs. It's stuck in your hands, and so it makes sense that this would have left a mark in lakes nearby because you put it in a fire, and the smoke plumes are essentially low pressures. They would have pumped dust into the air, which would have settled all around them.
hmm
But yeah, you quickly find out you pounded a few bits. You're like, oh, crap, there's some arsenic copper and there's some silver in there, and then it cracks in the middle,
yeah,
and you're in a world where you can't weld copper back together. Once it breaks, you might be able to break it in half, make it into a smaller awl or something like that, which I'm sure they did. But those big pieces, it makes them so much more amazing because they found such a big pure piece of copper that they were able to work without cracking into these shapes like that, those triangulate spearheads. So it
yeah.
just,
And speaking of the high quality copper, up in that northern variant interaction zone that I have on one of my maps, that's where we're finding all of the largest copper artifacts, most of them anyway.
hmm,
There's one really interesting one that unfortunately went missing a few decades ago. It was found by the Portage Canal up in copper country, right where the mines are near
mm-hmm,
Hancock and Houghton.
mm-hmm.
23-inch, 2.5-pound beveled socketed spearhead with two rivet holes in the socket. What would you need that thing for
Yeah,
when like
man.
your stone points and your tiny like 5-6 inch triangulates work just as well?
Yeah.
So you have the utilitarian aspect. I think that's undeniable at this point because some of these tools do show wear use. But with large tools like that, when you get like over 2 feet long and these things barely show any work use, I mean, that uh, that 23-inch spearhead, the tip, it's not pointed, it's rounded. So unfortunately, the article, it's one of the Wisconsin Archaeologist Journal articles, I think published in 1969. And unfortunately, it doesn't get into much depth on the artifact besides saying, hey, this is a really interesting artifact we have here. It's different than the stuff we're finding down south in the farmers' fields.
Yeah, you're almost at
It's
sword status,
well,
like the
speaking of
length.
storage, we actually have something like that from Thunder Bay. It was an artifact Harold Alanin found. I think he was walking along one of Thunder Bay's beaches with Terry Wilson, another well-known copper researcher, and they found this thing sticking out of the sand at a lake up there called Dog Lake. And there's a bunch of photos of it that Larry and others repost. The thing is 21 inches long. It's giant, and it barely shows any use. So what what I'm wondering is, are some of these copper tools, especially the really large ones, the ones where it really makes you scratch your head? Well, they don't show much use. They're larger than a mobile hunter-gatherer group would need. They're almost excessively large to the point where I wouldn't call them useless, but it's almost like they're showpieces, like status symbols, like, hey, we have access to all of this copper. Look at what we can do with it.
Hmm.
Because if you're living up there, you know, going around your environment year after year, or maybe some semi-sedentism at certain key spots with predictable animal runs or fish runs, to sustain a copper culture like that, a mining industry, as Ryan Peterson is calling it. And I think there's enough evidence now to support that. It doesn't just take food, it takes regional stability. How can you afford to mine copper for hundreds of years if you're always fighting with each other? And we have distant trade items. We have shell coming up from the Gulf and Atlantic coast. We have stones all the way from northern Labrador appearing in Thunder Bay
Hmm.
at archaic sites, which Terry Wilson has visited. And not only that, we have bison hunting related artifacts used by the Oxbow culture. Knife River flint, that's being found at Lake Superior's North Shore. So there's enough regional stability throughout the Middle and Late Archaic, aside from the droughts and the fluctuating Lake Superior shoreline, there's enough regional stability that people can maintain these long distance trade networks. They can
Mm.
maintain uh, a copper mining industry, shipping, you know, people, food, supplies back and forth between Isle Royale and Thunder Bay. And alongside all that, you have these mortuary traditions. Just that alone suggests that people are interacting enough from Maine all the way out to the Northern Great Plains. They're interacting enough to maintain those without them changing much. In some cases, not at all, after thousands of years.
That's a
So
good
it's
point.
yeah, it's a multi-layered puzzle
Hmm.
to look at it one way.
That kind of reminds me of the idea of Pax Romana, like the peaceful period. The Romans, they had this empire, and I think that's how you say it, Pax Romana or I don't know exactly if that's right. Where it's like, yeah, it's this period of stability, economic stability and peace, and we
Hmm.
actually see lead spikes that look exactly the same in the Roman mines in
Yeah,
Spain. It dated exactly to that period when the denarius is the world currency, and they had to mine to get this coin, which would make even less sense, not to try to explain why they had to mine in the Romans if we had no written records of the Roman Empire. You'd have to explain that this culture emerged out of Rome and it spread across the Mediterranean. And they made this little circular thing out of it that everybody wanted. They didn't eat it, though. It wasn't useful for anything, but they used it to trade with. And then you go, oh, whoa, that's really weird. And then they sent people up there to mine to get this silver and gold out of these hills. And then it left signals in nearby lakes. But here, at least, we can say we're pointing towards technologies that seem to make sense from that period economically, except then again, I guess these large items, like you're saying, essentially a sword, big spirits, they weren't really practical for anything except showing off, I would say.
and it's not just the large spearheads and well-made items like the spud. It's one of the most well-made items that I've seen so far that these people made. It was found not long after that giant 21-inch knife was found, but it's been noticed that the mining equipment on Isle Royale, it's different than what's been found in the Keweenaw. Isle Royale, it's mostly like ground hammerstones, right?
Yeah.
Isn't that what you? Yeah.
Yeah.
But you go down to the Keweenaw, they're more connected to the Midwest. We're finding a lot more grooved hammerstones there. And that's interesting because if you head down to Shell Mound Archaic territory, the earliest grooved axes that we found in situ are from that area.
Okay. Whoa.
Yeah. And the earliest stone, the last I checked, the earliest grooved stone axes in Wisconsin, 4800 BCE. So you have 5200 BCE, in Shell Mound Archaic for grooved axes. They start spreading up north, and by the time they reach the Keweenaw is when you get this. I don't know what you would want to call it, a boom era, when people on the Keweenaw and Isle Royale just start roughly at the same time extracting huge amounts of copper.
Mm.
Aside from fish hooks, you have all this float copper. If you're small, mobile hunter-gatherer bands, why do you need all that copper for hundreds of years? When you bring everything together, the shared mortuary traditions, the shared technologies, not just between the Shell Mound Archaic and the people living around the Keweenaw and Thunder Bay and Isle Royale, even other items like crescents. Monette Bebel Reinhard, she just published one of the last books in her copper book series documenting where these items have been found. And around Lake Superior, she's noted that's where most of these crescent items are. Have you seen any of those in
No,
your
I'm not.
visits up there? Talk with Larry or the other copper guys? No, okay, so
Is it like a banner stone, like those crescents for? We're thinking addles, like
no, that's a different type of artifact.
okay,
Do you know what an ulu is?
yeah, yeah,
Yeah. Okay, there we
okay,
go.
yeah, I know what you're talking about.
They made a lot of those. And what Monette's data is showing is most of those and other items, more ornamental crescents shaped like boats, those are mainly getting found in that northern interaction area. And some years ago, a well-known copper researcher named Jack Steinbring, he published an article proposing that it was a lunar symbolism, because the earliest dates we have at the peripheries of the old copper complex, they're crescent shaped items. We have one, I think, all the way out in western Alberta, western Saskatchewan, all the way out there. And if you look over to the east, when these copper using groups head up into Maine, they're making stone versions of those at a groundstone. So it's interesting that this northern variant with the access to like the highest quality copper not only has all these huge tools, but it also has these other items, the crescents, which Larry Furrow, he suggested that they're representing bison,
Bison.
and that would connect to later on with the Mishipeshu spirit, that oral tradition. You have this territorial guardian of copper associated with bison horns. Yeah, there's a lot of data going into this.
Mm. Okay, more evidence behind it. So you're really on it there.
Yeah, because you can look at, if I could bring up my database right now, I would, to show your audience just what I'm looking at from my end. But I've published a distribution map showing the hotspots where copper artifacts cluster, and it's not a uniform spread. The most have been found in Wisconsin and the Keweenaw Peninsula.
Mm-hmm.
There's another hotspot around Dog Lake, one over in Lake Champlain in Vermont, and there's another one heading up along the Mississippi into Manitoba. That one's significant because that's where Oxbow is. Their projectile points, their lithics, have been found in association with copper artifacts. And just like with Wisconsin, people up there living on the shores of not Lake Winnipeg,
Winnebago.
the lake systems up there, they're finding copper, a lot of copper up there. And so we have Knife River Flint heading east, copper heading west. And I suspect alongside those two, we're having an organic artifact trade. That way we can maintain these social connections and maintain this shared mortuary tradition that we see for thousands of years. Like throughout the Archaic, from 4500 BCE to 1000 BCE, red ochre burials with shell, and sometimes like in Wisconsin, we find that type of burial with crescents. And so that's significant to me, and it's been significant for others like Jack Steinbring.
Mm-hmm. Very cool. Why do you ignore the connection between the old world coming to North America to mine the copper? I see this comment all the time. And there's missing copper for the size of all that
Mm.
those mines, and archaeologists like big names like you with your big archaeology and all your backers. Why do you ignore that connection between the old world cultures coming to mine over in Lake Superior?
It's not that we're ignoring it. We've thoroughly investigated it and haven't found any convincing supporting evidence that there was any proto civilization or full fledged Eurasian civilization that set up around the Great Lakes, mined copper, and sent it back to Europe, whether it be mainland Europe, Italy, the Middle East, or even China. What we do have evidence for the European side of things are extensive copper mines, tin mines, gold working, lead working, arsenic working to produce all their copper artifacts. There are dozens of copper mines known across Europe and the British Isles, and even tin mines too in Cornwall and further east into Afghanistan. And a lot of their items have been chemically tested for isotopes because over in Europe, they don't really have the copper like we do over here in North America. A lot of their copper ore is impure. They have to break it out of the rock and they have to smelt it down into workable ingots. And from there, you take the ingot and you can smelt it down further into your clay mold to make your spearheads and all that. Those have been tested, and every test so far conclusively all point to European and Eurasian copper sources. So it's not that we haven't looked, it's that we have looked and we've come up empty handed.
There's no evidence. There's no.
Yeah, exactly.
And not to mention the lead spikes predate most of metalworking traditions. The lead spikes in Lake Superior predate the traditions for most metalworking across Europe as well. So it's actually metalworking seems to emerge before most of the European metalworking cultures around Lake Superior.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, because in your papers, that earliest spike, which uh, which could be mining. I've talked with other researchers who are more skeptical about that early date because they think it's too cold up there at that time to allow any intensive mining like that.
right? Yeah.
If
And, oh,
if
go
it
ahead.
is mining, if it is mining, and we have some evidence to support that, we have some pretty early copper forms, the Mercury Lancelot, Mercury Basin forms. Those are considered late Paleo to early Archaic. You can make those out of float copper, but you can also get them from mining the copper too. At that time, when you look over to the Eurasian side of things, they're not making any conical spear points or any tools or weapons. They're making ornaments and jewelry. And it's pretty much the same thing. Even when Northwest Africa's Copper Age gets started, they're focusing on small trinkets. It isn't until agriculture and settlements, permanent year-round settlements, start spreading into Europe and accessing their copper, do we get uh, like full-blown smelting technology with copper. Everything before that is just like the OCC, cold working and annealing.
I think what great answer to that. I just wanted to address in case we're going to get those comments about we're ignoring the connection with Eurasia. And also this does remind me that that old spike we find at 9500 years ago, and the lead spike in lake sediments from Lake Superior, just to be clear. It is reproducible, but it does precede the oldest reliable radiocarbon evidence for copper artifacts, which the oldest date we have is 8,500
Yep.
years BP, and that's from northern Wisconsin. There's nothing that even close to that age on Isle Royal. But I would say that it's possible mining could be happening. It's cold up there. Yes, there's ice northeast of the lake, but if there's sediment accumulating in lakes, that means it's an ice-free landscape. And also, it's a landscape probably with very few trees and almost no soil coverage. Therefore, very easy to come upon these veins of copper, which would have been highly resistant to erosion. So, would have been high points. And so that's why I think it's certainly possible that as people followed the ice retreating, they would have come across these exposures of copper. And then the second problem they would have had is how do we get it out of the bedrock? And that's where fires come in. That's all this stuff is feasible. And then we know native copper, it's pure. And another thing you often see is it's 99% pure native copper. Well, that's usually tested, first of all, on processed copper, like the artifacts. It's not,
Hmm.
no one's ever found a vein, extracted the copper out of it, and done it, because if they did do it, it would be very pure native copper, but it's full of crystal minerals. It would have been embedded in a rocky matrix. It's jagged. To cut you, you have to smack it flat. If you've actually seen raw copper out of a bedrock, it's a jagged mess of all kinds of stuff. Then there's arsenic copper, which is not malleable. So if you bind arsenic to copper and you heat it and smash it, it turns into a powder. And
Mm.
then you have silver inclusions too, which would have been an issue. So this whole 99% pure thing is kind of throws people off a little bit, because yeah, when you work the copper in a vein in the rock, it, it produces lots of powder from the impurities. And then on top of it, if you're pounding it and then putting it in a fire, the fire itself, anybody, you can do a test like this. Go on a big lake and you're fishing, and I've actually done this. If someone starts a campfire, you know, half a mile away on the lake, if the wind's blowing right, you'll smell the smoke. What does that mean?
Yeah.
It means it's activating the sensors in your mind and your brain, the tiny, minute bits. That means bits and pieces of that fire are actually hitting your nose, and then
Hmm.
they're hitting the water as well. And so, one thing we get with the lead spike, is that we don't have the imagination to imagine adding 1 atom of lead, 2 atoms of lead per million. We're talking part per million changes. We have instrumentation that goes down to part per billion, part per trillion. But with sediments, you can't do that. You have to use ice cores for that. We have a hard time envisioning the sensitivity of highly pure, highly pristine freshwater lakes around Lake Superior. They are unimaginably sensitive to pollution. And I'm not saying like this is not an argument like I'm trying to like EPA us or something. It's just detectable. It may not
Hmm.
even be necessarily toxic to the fish. I don't think it was actually, or even really to the people compared to what we did in the modern. But that doesn't mean that the pollution isn't detectable. And pollution just means derived from human activity, and it contaminates air and water nearby. That is a highly politically charged word today, pollution, because
Oh
it's
yeah.
it's like they say, "Oh, you're just the pollution. It's negative." Of course, these leftists want to, do this, and the Native Americans polluted, therefore we can pollute. And that
Mm.
that kind of logic doesn't work. Yeah,
No.
that's why that 9,500-year-old spike. The first paper I had in 2013, we didn't even go back that far because we didn't think there'd be a possibility. But once we started going back and we had solid dates, we started finding another spike, and then it was reproducible. It's found at Copper Falls Lake, Lake Manganese, and Lily Lake. And then in Boston only has one early archaic spike in the southern Keweenaw. It's a little bit later, but I think I remember it's somewhere around 9,000, 8,500
Yeah, it's
years ago.
it's one of the earliest ones.
Yeah, so that spike is there. It's reproducible. It's consistent with every other signal. It looks like a mining peak signal you'd find in Spain from the Roman Empire, from China's dynasties in Southeast Asia, produce the same looking spikes. And no one raises doubts on those. I know they're more solidly understood, the histories there. but it's very strange. Even the middle archaic spikes here in lead in Lake Superior, mainstream archaeologists really don't want to buy it. And it's very, to me, seems like they still hold this inherent bias towards the Native Americans. They publicly say we need to stop looking at them as primitive people, but when you show them this evidence, they go, well, they weren't good enough at it to do that.
It's like something clicks, but it doesn't click, all the way. Like
Yeah.
you're seeing these tool forms where anywhere else in the world, they'd be associated with the earliest city-states or the earliest dynasties in China. Yet over here, we're not saying that's what was happening here. There's no huge cities made of stone. There's no processional causeways. There's none of that with the old copper people. We're having a hard time even finding campsites. So,
Wow. Yeah.
and with the shoreline issue, it's possible. We don't have any evidence for this yet, but it's possible if human societies are anything alike to one another. Just that common human baseline, from a psychological point of view, if they're anything at all similar, you would expect with technology like this, a mining industry, at least some semi-sedentism. But we're having a hard time even finding that.
Yeah. Yes.
And what doesn't help either is Kenneth Sassaman. He did a literature review back before he published his Eastern Archaic Historicized book. And what he noted was the Archaic, it's the least studied period in North American history. It's less, well, at least at that time, it received less book mentions, less article mentions, less regional synthesis methods. It received less funding than the Woodland period, Paleo period, the Mississippian period, and the Contact period. It's one of the least known eras of North American history, even among professionals working in that area. Like there are people who know up there, like professionals who know next to nothing
Oh yeah.
about the old copper culture.
Yeah. Yeah. Yep.
So it's incredible, but at the same time, it's really disappointing.
Mm-hmm.
And it's unfortunate too that right here in North America, Canada, and the United States, you're sitting on this. If this was over in China or in Europe or Japan, this would make international news. People would be talking about this for weeks and weeks and weeks.
Yeah.
But because it was made by Native Americans, it's been assumed for so long by, genuine racism that, these were Stone Age tribes.
Yeah.
Not only didn't they didn't have the means to make these, a lot of people, even politicians, said they couldn't do stuff like this because they simply weren't smart enough. And they could never be smart enough just because they're Native Americans.
I didn't want to. Yeah.
It's a tragic history.
I didn't want to.
It's unfortunate.
Yeah. I didn't want to have to say the word racism, but I do think that's really what it is. And, it's found, I have colleagues on the papers I've worked on. They're on there and they still have a hard time buying it. And they've been out. Yeah. They've been out there and, I published those papers and I would talk to colleagues in the field of studying lake sediment research. And, 5-10 years later, as I kept publishing and more data kept pointing toward it, so they were like, I never believed it at first, but nowadays I think you might be right. And I'm like, you didn't say anything back when I was doing it. It's going through peer review. Even Susan Martin, who wrote the book,
Wonderful Power.
Yeah, wrote Wonderful Power. She's, I think, on board with the lead being from mining, but at first was like, it wasn't intensive enough. I don't think it would work. When I was doing my research as, starting the study, starting my PhD, reaching out to these experts, she was the first one and she just said what she thought. And I'm not saying what she did was wrong or bad or anything, because she had no idea. But when she said that I don't think it'll work, I was like, well, there's only one way to find out. And luckily I didn't listen. And secondly, I had an advisor, my advisor, Mark Abbott, and I'll give him a shout out again. I put him in the book too, because he used lake sediments to study Incan and Tiwanaku pollution in South America. And as an undergrad, I had seen his papers. I'm like, oh, you can use lakes to study histories of metallurgy. Then I heard this in class. I wrote about it in the book. And I was like, no one's used lake sediments though to study the mining history of Michigan, even though the birthplace, the center of American paleolimnology, studying sediment cores, is University of Minnesota in Minneapolis, Twin Cities. They're right there. They're right south of the lake. They had never, no one before me in I think I went there 2010 and published in 2013. I'm like 25 years old. I'm the first person that's done that. That shows you that the bias of, I'm talking liberal academics towards the Native Americans, and they don't even say it in their mind. It's so inherent in the way they believe, and that they wouldn't investigate it. But Mark Abbott did. He's like, there's only one way to find out. It seems like it could work. Let's give it a shot. And then even when we started, we only did like the first 5,000 years of sediment, because we're like, there's no way it can be older than that. And we saw this little blip right near the end of 5,000. He's like, oh, we got to extend this all the way back to when the lake forms. Then we started seeing these anomalies, and he's like, we started looking in the lab. We're like, these look like human spikes. I mean, what the heck's going on here? And then we're like, we got to do another lake. And we were reproducing it. Then that's when we did 3 sites, and we published that first paper in 2013 in Environmental Science and Technology. It went on the news, I believe, for maybe that one. And attracted some attention and interest at that point. Yeah.
Yeah, the thing with Native, well, at least back then during the Archaic, with most Native American cultures being hunter-gatherers, either, completely mobile or higher up on the scale, towards the more complex ones with semi-sedentism and possibly even year-round sedentism, like what's being proposed for Maine with their swordfish hunters, or even up in the Pacific Northwest with their salmon runs. It's decades of academics getting locked up in theories and frameworks and not pushing enough against those to challenge the frameworks. There were a series of articles and books written back throughout the 60s and 70s investigating hunter-gatherer tribes, and there was one major one called Man the Hunter, and it framed early hunting and gathering societies as the ideal, like the original affluent society, completely egalitarian, absolutely, everyone equal, tiny, like, family groups moving around the environment, always looking for the next meal.
Mm-hmm.
And what I don't want to say that this is, widespread, that this framework has gotten applied widespread across North America, because it hasn't, but the effects of that are being noted today. There's a bunch of hunter-gatherer literature coming out from North America, from Russia, Japan, acknowledging the issues that this old framework has caused. It's caused a lot of hunting and gathering societies which show enough evidence for situational hierarchies or trans-egalitarianism, or even, like I'm suggesting with these copper people, maybe some level of proto-chiefdom, but a proto-chiefdom we're not familiar with because it's not based on agriculture. It's based on intensive fishing and maybe some wild rice harvesting. That and a lot of food surplus. Because during the contact area and during migrations westward, when Euro-Americans and even when the Chinese were coming in during the gold rush, tribes and cultures across the Americas showed completely different social structures. They weren't all egalitarian. You had Like the Calusa, very hierarchical, no agriculture, none at all. They're
Hmm.
just hunting and fishing. You go up to the Pacific Northwest, again, they're complex hunter gatherers. They're living in plank houses. They have a mix of mobile bands, semi-sedentism, and some year-round sedentism at key fish runs and hunting grounds. Again, they're not completely egalitarian. They're stratified, and even down in the Chumash, Southern California, again, they're specializing in swordfish hunting. That takes a special knowledge set, knowing the way the air feels, knowing storms, knowing the ocean currents, what's going on under the water and what's going on top of the water. It's a very specialized skill set that led to these very, how could you call it? Something comparable to a chief. These well-connected, incredibly knowledgeable ritual specialists who know how to be intermediaries between the known and the unknown, who know how to get out there, get all these resources and bring them back to the community. And so what I'm wondering is a lot of this literature looking at hunter and gathering societies for the archaic that frames them all the same way. Like egalitarians here, OCC, egalitarian there, down at Poverty Point, egalitarian. I'm really wondering how flawed is that? Because there's plenty of evidence coming out now when we look at the regional interactions or even the continental trade. I've seen you mention this in some of your previous episodes. The obsidian found in the Eastern Great Lakes,
Yeah.
coming all the way from out west, thousands of years ago.
Yeah. Yeah.
And what I show in my maps that we have abalone from Southern California, a group that's known at that time during the Archaic to have used red ochre and flex and extended burials, and even at least one dog burial associated with red ochre and shell from Central California. Somehow, between the Middle and Late Archaic, abalone is coming all the way out from California into Tennessee and northern Alabama, and even possibly some dentalium from the Pacific Northwest is also getting down there somehow. How are you doing that unless there's peace? Maybe not widespread, but there's enough to sustain that trade for hundreds and thousands of years, to sustain the copper mining, and to sustain the shared mortuary expression that we see. The red ochre, how it's almost always paired with shells, whether local mollusks or marine shells, either from the Pacific, the Gulf Coast, Atlantic. How it's almost always flexed or semi-flexed burials. Some are associated with turtle shells, others are associated with eagle talons or dog teeth or wolf canines. It's like the same shared expression for thousands of years across the continent. And so I think looking at the evidence available now, if you bring it all together into a GIS database, like I and at least a couple others I think have been doing, it opens up more social forms besides just pure egalitarianism that would allow for you to have this intensive mining industry and everything else that was going on back then.
Very cool. So, Dylan Violette, where can people find you online if they want to talk to you more about your ideas or maybe work with you?
The main place I'm at right now is Reddit, Copper Violet.
For Violet?
Yeah,
And that
u slash Copper Violet. I should come up. I've been posting to the Ancient Americas subreddit, the fan page devoted to that channel. I also post on X from time to time, and recently I've been on Discord in different history groups, talking with other people there, focusing on different regions of the world.
cool. Man, this was an amazing conversation. Thanks for taking the time out of your day to talk with me. I've learned so much, and I think people that watch this have learned so much. And I hope someone reaches out and wants to work with you on the synthesis papers. I hope maybe one day you finish your bachelor's degree, maybe you can get a PhD, find a fellowship and someone to work with, or a TA assistantship. They help pay for your graduate school. If you find the right program, you don't have to pay tuition or anything. You work your way through. Maybe one day I hope to see that you can get that. I don't know if that's something that interests you at this point.
And no, it definitely does. I've been looking around for colleges, and Rob Wheeler, I think you
I
know
know
who
him.
he is.
Yeah.
Yeah, president and founder of the Copper Conservancy
Hmm.
Society. Yeah, he messaged me earlier today, and he wants to have a phone meeting sometime next week if I'm available.
Hmm. I mean,
So,
Michigan Tech would be the place I feel like that you could go. There's an industrial archaeology program there. It's in the Michigan Upper Peninsula. They don't have anybody doing old copper culture stuff, and I don't know if
mm,
it's feasible in that program, but maybe that's what Bob has in mind. Or, but I'm glad you're talking. We call him Bob, Robert Wheeler. I know him very well. I've stayed at his house, and he's
oh, no
actually on
kidding.
my channel. He has a talk on my channel. We gave presentations at the Carnegie Museum of the Keweenaw last summer. So if you're interested in this subject, check out both those talks on my channel. They were published a few months ago. And if you enjoyed this conversation, I want to ask you to please subscribe to the channel. It is free, or like the video. If you drop some comments below, I'm sure I'll be following the comments, and I'm sure Dylan will check them out. We'll try to answer every question that you have. Appreciate everybody tuning in. And Dylan, thanks again. Bye.
Hey, yeah, you're welcome. Take care.